So everybody asks if I'm nervous, and I feel like there's a paper test. You have to hold a piece of paper. Is it shaking? A little bit. So I must be. So I'll try to find oh, you're looking at me. I'll find my people around the room I can look at and keep focused. So I'm going to start kind of in the middle and then go back to the back, or the beginning. But spring break 2004. Chris, stop talking. A group of us were sitting on the floor, lining the halls of a dorm building at the Adventist Academy and Orphanage Grounds in El Salvador, where we're helping build a church. It was Friday evening, and we had just been sitting around chatting when the organizer of our mission trip told us that they needed speakers the next day for both the academy kids and the elementary kids. Understandably, most everyone started to fidget and look away. It's estimated that 40% of the population has a fear of public speaking. Couple that with the fact that we were being asked only the night before we would speak, and well, suddenly everyone was super tired and decided they were headed to bed. An older adult in our group stood up and agreed to speak to the academy students. The elementary school kids' sermon remained open, and my mind started to process. They're just kids, right? I mean, this doesn't have to be like a deep theological sermon, basically just a story with an application. How hard could it be? And doesn't the Bible tell us that the words to say will be given to us at the right time? My hand shot up. I'll do it, I proclaimed. The matter settled, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and we headed to our respective rooms. I decided that it would be good to at least have a rough idea of where I was going with my talk instead of just completely winging it. So me and a friend sat down together to work out some details. We had landed on a story in a favorite book of mine and tweaked it a bit to fit the setting. The story seemed compelling enough to fill some space, but the exact application eluded us. Oh, well, it was kind of late and we were tired, and surely the words would come to me at the time, so we threw in the towel and got some sleep. The next day dawned hot and muggy, typical for Central Oregon in March. I reviewed the story I would tell, continuing to draw a blank as to what I would say after telling it. With only a small amount of worry creeping into my mind, I headed with the group off to the school where the elementary kids met in their cafeteria for church. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it seems that there were maybe 200-ish kids plus adults in attendance. That might be a bit. How many people are here? 100? 80, so maybe like 150 plus adults. Anyway, it sounds better if there's 200. I sat on the podium looking serene and in control while the service moved through the preliminaries. Finally, it was my time to speak. Walking forward, I stood behind the lectern and started my story. It fortunately took about double the time due to the translator, and after about 4 minutes, it was time for me to make my application. I opened my mouth, waiting for the words to flow, and nothing came out. Panic-stricken, I dug deep into my mind. Surely I had something to say. I looked wildly to the translator, a fellow missionary on the trip, hoping that she would jump in with her own spirit-led words. She just looked at me, waiting to translate. I hesitated and then stumbled through a couple of minutes of one of the most socially painful experiences of my life and quickly sat back down. Afterwards, the congregants were merciful, only giving me, "Thank you for your words, sister," instead of, "What in the world was that?" And the kids, I'm sure, were glad to be over with church within 7 minutes. All this to say, I actually prepared this talk. So my story starts, as all ours do, with a man and a woman. In 1943, my father was born the fourth of 7 children to hardworking farm parents. 3 years later, my mother was born the middle of 3 children to similarly hardworking farm parents. My dad's parents were conservative Seventh-day Adventists, and throughout his childhood, my dad saw some what he thought were discrepancies between what his parents practiced and preached. I told myself not to get off topic, but I will say they raised chickens, and he was like, "We shouldn't be raising chickens. Meat chickens," okay? Anyway, on top of that, he became ill from whooping cough when he was less than 2. If he were to survive the illness, his mother promised God that she would make sure that he became a pastor. He survived, and his mother was sure to remind him that he owed it to God to become a pastor. Over the years, things got more tense between my dad and his parents, and when he left for academy at UCA at age 16, he never lived at home again. He eventually joined the military and ended up living in Maryland. My mom grew up with Presbyterian parents who she felt were committed to attending church, but did not translate their spiritual commitment across the rest of the aspects of their lives. They were hardworking, good people, but did not necessarily know Jesus on a personal level. My mom grew up, finished college, and wanting to see a different part of the country, she moved to Maryland, where she worked at the State School for the Deaf. I'm not really sure of all the details, but my mom had become engaged to a man named Jim, and she was trying to book a hotel for their wedding reception. She went to one of the hotels in Maryland where my dad was working as the manager. As she spoke with him about booking a reception hall, he reportedly said, "You don't want to get married." Their stories diverge as to why he would say this, but the ending is the same. She broke things off with Jim, and my parents ended up getting married. They relocated to Banks, Oregon, and proceeded to build 2 houses in the woods. During this time, my older brother Lee was born in 1975, and I came around 2 years later in 1977. It was also during this time that things began to unravel between my parents. Sometime after my dad had left home, he completely stepped away from anything that he had been taught by his parents, and he developed an addiction to alcohol. My parents built big houses and drove new cars and had new kids, and there was no Dave Ramsey back then. Oh, you're over there. I was like, where'd Ben go? My dad was managing a glove manufacturing company at the time, and without the balancing piece of God, they were unable to manage the stress of their life decisions. Couple that with my dad's addiction, and my parents ended up getting divorced when I was around the age of 5. From a spiritual perspective, this is a time of my life I like to think of as God, coyotes, and quiche. I had heard of God. People had mentioned him from time to time, but we did not pray or attend church. We did not read the Bible or have it read to us. I recall attending a vacation Bible school where they dramatized the Pilgrim's Progress. I remember distinctly thinking, dude, just take off the massive backpack. It'll make your life way easier. Clearly, the spiritual application eluded me. The first house I remember living in was in the middle of the forest. Often at night after the sun had gone down, our dogs would start to freak out barking, and my mom would look out the window saying, "There's a coyote out in the yard." I would always look, but I never saw a coyote. Whether it would run off before I could see it, or I just didn't know what I was looking for, I don't know, but eventually I stopped looking. I remember thinking God was elusive like those coyotes. A dish my mom enjoyed when I was young was quiche. I have come to like quiche, especially because I know what is in it now, but at the time, quiche made my stomach drop. I mean, just think about how quiche looks. Typically brown and kind of slick on top, and then immediately underneath, there's this kind of pillowy, yellowish, whitish, bubbly layer, and there's other ingredients in it, onions, peppers, bacons, sometimes the dreaded mushroom. And if you prepare these things and put them in there, you know what they are when you encounter them. But when I was a kid, tears filled my eyes as these mysterious ingredients hovered in the midst of the yellow, puffy layer. All I could think was, what in the world is this stuff? I remember hating and fearing quiche so much that my brother and I buried our chunks under our aunt's porch when our mom wasn't looking. God, like quiche, was mysterious. After my parents' divorce, my mom decided to downsize, and we moved to a home in a new subdivision being built in Hillsboro, Oregon. This was a sad move for me. My brother and I had been each other's best friends when we lived in the woods. We had a pond with ducks, acres to explore, and a big playroom with a full-size rocking horse with a real saddle. We would blast the William Tell Overture on our plastic record player and jump on the horse, rocking so wildly it would travel across the room. Eventually, we ended up rocking over and destroying William Tell and our record player. When we moved, we got cable TV and started letting the Disney Channel live our adventures for us. We didn't bring spring grass into the house to play Bambi, unknowingly bringing a live lizard in with us. We stopped trying to sell pop from pop stands we would set up in the middle of the forest. We didn't climb trees, my brother all the way to the top, and me just a couple of branches up. I can't speak for him, but I definitely felt a magic loss from our lives in this move. My brother developed different friendships and different interests. He was no longer my best friend, and we no longer lived a life that fostered adventure and creativity like it had in the past. Around this same time, both of my parents remarried. My mom rekindled a childhood friendship and married a man 30 years her senior. That must have been some childhood friendship, but sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Gosh. Okay. Where's the tissues? Oh, okay. Normally people cry for different reasons, but anyway. Whew. How do I get back on track? My dad had been through a rehabilitation process and married a woman 22 years. His junior, this is not getting better. Okay. These two unions had very different effects on our family dynamics. When we would go make it stop. Okay. Pray for me, people. We would go on day hikes. With a few apples, granola bars, and water bottles in our backpack, we would head out a mile or two, see a mountain lake, whistle at a marmot, and then always head back to the campground. We'd beg my dad to just go just a little bit further, just over that next ridge, just to that snowpack up there. We really wanted to hike in the snow. I don't know why. He told us that if we wanted to go further, we needed to go backpacking. And if we wanted to go backpacking, he needed another adult with him. Once again, I'm off topic, but Ben's dad would take his kids backpacking by himself. Didn't you? Yeah. So anyway, my dad was like, no, that's not safe. Anyway, that settled it. He needed to get remarried. When he met Terry, my now stepmother, we asked her right away if she could just marry him already because we needed to go backpacking. Terry is a fantastic person, and I'm glad my dad found her, but all I have to say about backpacking is careful what you wish for. I probably could spend the rest of my time here talking about the misery that is backpacking, but I'll save that for some future children's stories sometime. My dad had, in his rehabilitation process, rekindled the seeds of faith that had been planted in his heart as a child, and he and Terry committed their lives to Christian service. My dad began to fulfill the promise his mother had made to God back when he was 2, and he enrolled at Walla Walla College as a theology major. He also made a very significant life decision at this time. He started to pray daily for his family. Meanwhile, my mom's new marriage had a dividing effect on our family. Ken, my stepfather, was an angry and jealous man, and while he never laid a hand on anybody, he had an unspoken ability to bring strife. We soon moved to a larger house with a little land, a pool, and a daylight basement. Ken settled into the basement so that he didn't have to interact with us kids, and basically we were not allowed to be down there. My mom would go down to the basement in the evenings, eat dinner, and watch TV with Ken, while Lee and I ate dinner while watching TV upstairs. It's not that we never saw our mom, we did, and she spent time with us. But any family cohesiveness that we had was severed by her relationship with Ken. For reasons unbeknownst to me, my mom and Ken started attending church regularly. We had never attended a church with any regularity before this, so I don't know what spurred this decision on her part, but they started attending regularly. After church, they would go to breakfast at a local restaurant, effectively leaving Lee and I at home alone for about 3 hours or so every Sunday morning. I really can't say what was going on through his mind at the time, but in my experience, my brother transitioned from a casual acquaintance to a tormentor. One of his frequent ways to torment me was to get into these extremely physical wrestling matches with a dog that we had at the time. Bobby was an Australian Shepherd, and quite frankly, the most horrible dog I have ever had any interaction with. Does anybody have Australian Shepherds? I'm sorry. Do you like them? Okay. Ours was horrible. She was dominant, independent, and stubborn beyond reason. Therefore, when my brother would start to rile her up, she would fight back as hard as she could. He would wait until Mom and Ken would leave, and eventually some teeth and claw wrestling match would ensue. He knew it bothered me, and I would tell him to stop or not be so rough with her, and he would just ask me what I was going to do about it. I remember a time when I was sitting in a chair telling him to leave the dog alone. He walked right up to me where I was sitting, stood over me, our knees practically touching, and asked me what I was going to do about it. I tried to get up and out of the chair. I tried to overpower him, but I couldn't, and he laughed at me. This posture, him looming over me in a position of power, was his psychological posture over me for many years. I decided I need a break, so I insisted on going to church with my mom and Ken. We attended a Foursquare gospel church, and it was here that my mom's eyes were first opened to a Savior who loved her and wanted to know her. She said she would just sit there and cry during those first sermons as she heard about a God who wanted to know her personally. My early experience was one of little understanding, and I frankly found the sermons a bit boring to sit through. But one thing I knew is that I was safe there. There were no tormentors, and I was at peace. My first real experience with God happened after I had been attending the church for a couple of years. A habit I had developed as a child was to use some pretty trashy talk. I don't know where my brother and I learned to swear like sailors, but I suppose all kids are eventually exposed to bad language. We just managed to adopt it as our own. I didn't openly use bad language around my mom or Ken, but when Lee and I would be off doing something, we would freely use whatever words we knew. I knew this bothered my mom, as she would get pretty upset if she overheard us, but on the few occasions I chose to stop, it seemed like I was unable to. I had been attending church for a while at this point, and while the sermon still did not hold a lot of detailed meaning for me, I became convicted to get baptized. I didn't rise from the water and scream hallelujah or anything, but as we were driving home in the car, I knew I had been delivered from swearing. Just like that, I was able to choose the words that had come out of my mouth. It was my first experience with the changing power of God in my life. Around the same time, I was just hanging around the house one day and I decided to read the Bible. So far, the words of the Bible had to me been basically like listening to German. The pastor at our church would read them and then would have to translate everything into a common vernacular that I could grasp. But there's nothing like having God's own words speak directly to your heart. I don't remember what book I opened to or anything, but I started reading and was startled to find that what I assumed would be difficult to understand was actually very clear. God was speaking to me through his word for the first time, and I remember being elated. Now I could go to God's word and hear from him for myself. It was another step on the path of the relationship he wanted to build with me. A year or so later, on a hot summer afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen counter eating some kind of melon. I don't know why I remember I was eating melon, but my brother was standing near me, and my mom had just told us she was going to go downstairs to check on Ken. He hadn't been feeling well that morning and had gone to lay down, an uncharacteristic move for him. As she departed, I had a strong impression that Ken had died. Right when my mom yelled frantically up the stairs for us to call 911, I grabbed the phone and we ran downstairs. Ken was gray and floppy, and I called while my mom and brother performed CPR on him. Ken was not resuscitated that day, and while I was sad for my mom and her loss, I honestly can't say I was upset that he had died. One thing I have to say about Ken is that he had a family prior to marrying my mom. Because he was so surly, he had a strained relationship with his daughter while she was growing up. Is that our kids screaming? I told Linda, I was like, fortify yourself, Linda, they're wild. And she said she could handle it, so. And eventually he had no contact with her at all as an adult. My mom is a very social person who was raised in an open door type of home, and it did not sit well with her that Ken didn't interact with his daughter. So my mom reached out. In those last years of Ken's life, he spent more valuable time with his daughter than he probably had in his entire life. Despite the division he brought to our family, giving those last years of reconciliation to his daughter is worth the sacrifice. This was my first experience of God as a reconciler. We moved again, my mom finding herself once again a single parent with too much property to care for on her own. A word for single parents here. As a child, it never occurred to me how incredibly daunting this must have been for my mom to be the sole adult making all the decisions for a family. Having my own kids now, the thought of being faced with a situation like this is completely overwhelming, and I have an immense amount of respect for my mom's strength and fortitude, and for the strength and fortitude of all single parents. If you are a single parent, you are an amazing and likely underappreciated person. I just want to say on behalf of a person raised by a single parent, thank you. Over the years, my mom had spoken many times about a friend, Marilyn, that she had growing up. They had been friends all through their childhood and high school years, having many adventures with horses, but it never occurred to me to ask what happened to Marilyn. I had been riding horses for a few years by this time, and I had just sold my horse. We needed a new place to keep a horse if I was going to get another one, and my mom said she had seen this nice barn about 15 minutes from our house. She decided we should go take a look at it and see if they boarded horses. We walked into a barn on a Sunday afternoon and saw a lady coming down the aisle. As she drew closer, my mom says, "Well, I know you." Turns out the barn was owned by my mom's childhood friend, Marilyn. Apparently, they had actually had a falling out after high school and hadn't even seen or spoken to one another in about 20 years or so. There's no reason my mom would have known where Marilyn lived. God definitely brought us to the right person at the right time. At this time, I should probably do the water. Hang on, sorry. At this time of my life, any friends I had at school were starting to experiment with drugs and teenage relationships. A close friend I had had during grade school had moved on to other friends, and we had little interaction anymore. I was somewhat adrift and potentially could have gone any number of directions at this point. Fortunately, Marilyn took me under her wing. Walking into her barn that afternoon set me on a course of purpose for the next several years as we trained and showed horses together. I turned 16 during this time, got my driver's license, and bought my 1976 Forest Green Ford Courier. Has anybody had a Ford Courier? No? Okay, you're missing out. The freedom that truck bought me was invaluable. I could go to work with the horses, and I got much more involved in the church, participating in community outreach, prayer meetings, and leadership, as well as weekly services. I want to pause for a moment and say that if you ever get a chance to mentor a young person, or if you are a young person and get the chance to have a good mentor, please do not shy away from this opportunity. Marilyn literally changed my life at a pivotal time. She is honest, firm, hardworking, funny, and fiercely loyal. She remains one of my most significant friends to this day, and I am beyond grateful to her for the time she took to invest in me. My mom and she also rekindled their friendship and see each other several times a month. The summer I was 16 and my brother was 18, my dad and Terry came to pick us up for our annual summer week with them. They had rented a cabin on Hayden Lake in Idaho. My brother had recently taken a construction job, and since he was 18, he did not feel he was compelled to vacation with my dad every summer. So he opted to stay home and work. I had never gone on a summer trip without Lee before, and while we weren't close, I was less close with my dad, so I was reluctant to take the trip without Lee. However, I was a people pleaser and had also recently learned Terry was pregnant. I didn't want to hurt my dad's feelings, and I was excited about the idea of having a new sibling, so I agreed to go. This was a significant decision and was the first time I ever interacted with my dad on an individual basis. It was the first building block to a real relationship with him, and I'm glad that I went. I eventually graduated from high school and attended community college for a couple of years. During this time, my brother stopped harassing me and basically just ignored me. He lived his life and I lived mine. We never talked or interacted with each other in any way. He had a long and tumultuous relationship with a girlfriend at the time, and they got married. I finished up at community college and attended Walla Walla College. My dad had finished his theology degree at Walla Walla a decade prior and was working as a pastor in Alaska. I had had good memories of taking walks and going to the DX. Is it the DX? Is that right? The little ice cream place, people. Yes, the DX. Okay, thank you. Where they would visit my dad there, and I didn't really know where I wanted to attend college or what I wanted to study. I got subsidized tuition since my dad worked for the church, so Walla Walla seemed like as good a choice as any. While I was at Walla Walla, my brother went through a really painful divorce, and he sent me a letter apologizing for the person he had been to me, asking forgiveness and saying he wanted to start to get to know me. I can't say that this opened the floodgates of sibling affection at the time, but it was a supremely vulnerable and humble thing for him to do, and it was a start. I wrote him back and said that I was in. Walla Walla was a bit of a culture shock for me, as I was over 4 hours from home and didn't know a soul there. I suddenly had no friends, no church, and no family. I had asked to room in the dorm alone, but due to space constraints, this was not possible. My roommate was one of the most acutely introverted people I have ever met, and not exactly being a social lion myself, it took a fair amount of painful and awkward time, but we eventually developed a close friendship and were roommates even for years beyond college. God had brought me a friend. During my senior year, I was on staff of the college newspaper as a copy editor. One of my fellow copy editors invited me home to her parents' house one weekend. Her parents lived on an orchard in the Yakima Valley. They had horses and a boat and were super welcoming. Turns out they had actually housed my dad years before while he was doing a pastoral internship in their church. I effectively adopted myself into their family, and they, along with my college roommate, are still my second family to this day. We have spent countless hours riding horses, boating, camping, eating food, and laughing. God had brought me a family. As far as church goes, I only had the experience with the Foursquare church I had been attending back home. I assumed all churches were the same, so I initially attended the college church, but quickly realized it wasn't for me. I attended a handful of other churches in town and experienced increasing despair as nothing seemed to be a good fit like my church back home. On one of my trips to visit my friends in the Yakima Valley, their pastor came to visit their house. I remember thinking immediately, this is my pastor. And sure enough, he made a transfer to the Eastgate Church in Walla Walla within a few weeks of that time. God had brought me a church. I graduated from Walla Walla with my bachelor's in communications and started working for the college as a graphic designer. I decided the next step in life was to get married. Not having a lot of direction or instruction in this area other than Hollywood movies, I figured you just met someone you liked and married them. I don't have time for all the details, but I will say over the next several years, I had a few dramatic relationships with men who struggled with various addictions. I have some things to say about addiction, and I will first illustrate with a story. I had been dating a guy on and off for a year or so. He worked in a similar capacity to me at the college, and we had traveled together to a conference in Florida. One night when I got back to my hotel room, I heard this intermittent beeping sound. The sound was coming from one of those little safes that are in hotels sometimes where you can lock up your valuables. The thing was beeping twice every few seconds. I assumed it was a battery issue, so I opened the safe and looked around where I thought the battery might be, but I didn't see an obvious place for it. It was kind of late, and I didn't know if anybody at the front desk would know how to fix it, so I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and wrapped it around the safe and then shut the door of the cabinet it was located in. It muffled the noise enough to make it seem more distant, and I went to bed. A thunderstorm had been brewing, and I fell asleep to the sound of rain and thunder, occasional flashes of lightning filling the room. I might have been having a dream, and I woke suddenly to the physical sensation of something reaching up from the foot of the bed and clawing at my legs and feet, trying to pull me down. I snatched my knees up and switched on the bedside light. I rolled out of the bed to my knees, grabbing my Bible, and started to pray and read. The storm had settled right over the hotel, and thunder and lightning crashed simultaneously. Rain poured down, and the safe had gone from an intermittent beeping to a constant and increasingly frantic beep. I called on the name of Jesus to eradicate this attack from my hotel room, and with a final series of continuous beeps, the safe went silent. The storm moved on, and a gentle rain fell outside. I was scared to get back in bed for fear I would be scratched at again, but eventually God calmed my mind and body enough, and I climbed back into bed, holding my Bible to my chest. God's word truly does have physical power, and I was actually able to sleep for the rest of the night. So here's what I have to say about addiction. Addiction does not happen in a vacuum. All of our lives are intertwined with other people's lives in some way, whether we know it or not. While I do not blame that guy for the attack on in my hotel room that night, I do hold him accountable for leaving the door of evil open in his life, therefore opening it into mine. I could be equally as culpable for letting a person with addiction into my life, but there are those who have no choice. Children, parents, friends, acquaintances, people whose lives may have innocently or ignorantly interacted with ours. If you are struggling with addiction, even if you think it's secret and no one knows it, even if you think you have a handle on it and it's not hurting anyone, it is. Name it, bring it to light, and begin your healing process. Trust me, no matter how good a job you think you are doing at keeping things in check, it is affecting innocent people in inadvertent ways. Addiction can be shameful, and it's difficult to bring it to the forefront and talk about it, but no one is alone in any addiction. Nothing is new under the sun, and anything any of us struggle with has been struggled with before. Freedom will be found if we speak up and acknowledge the truth. Remember when I said earlier that my dad had made a decision for when my dad made a decision for rehabilitation, he started praying for our family? It didn't matter that my parents were divorced. We had still been a family, and the divorce did not eradicate him from the responsibility he held for spiritual leadership, though it looked different now. While at first he had covered us with the blanket of addiction, now he had replaced it with a blanket of prayer, and I believe that this was powerful during the times like I just described to you. Pray for your families. It matters. I worked for the college for 4 years and eventually decided that sitting in front of a computer 5 days a week wasn't for me. I had spent the previous 4 years planning events, doing graphic design, photography, and print project management. I was decent at all of these things, but it just wasn't something I could see myself doing for years to come. The problem was, I had no idea what I could see myself doing. I started down the path of several other careers. I was going to be a teacher, a marriage and family counselor, and a youth pastor. I walked down these paths as far as they could go, but eventually I would always think, no, that doesn't seem right either. It was while I was in Portland assisting with a photo shoot at the college's nursing campus that a new thought struck me. Maybe I should try nursing. I soon thereafter quit my job, moved to Oregon City, and enrolled in nursing prerequisites. To this day, I can't really say why I moved away from Walla Walla. I could have just as easily quit my job and done nursing prerequisites there. It would have been a lot cheaper. I guess I felt I needed a change though, so I moved. One thing I want to point out is that I had a bit of pushback during this time of transition in my life. People who knew me well were telling me it didn't make any sense for me to quit my job because it was, quotes, obviously what I was gifted in. At the same time, complete strangers would approach me and say that my hands were anointed for healing. It can be a little difficult to sort out life's best moves when you have a lot of conflicting evidence coming from well-intentioned people. All I can say is that this is where the personal relationship with God comes in. Personal conviction won out in this case, and while I was not 100% sure that nursing was the direction I would ultimately lead, I was 100% sure that graphic design and communications was not for me, no matter how good I may have been at it. I moved from Oregon City to Beaverton and eventually back to Hillsboro in my mom's house. When I had moved to Walla Walla, it was not under the best of terms with my mom. Teen and young adults strive for the likely culprits, and it was for the most part a good experience to live with her for a short time and rebuild a bit of our relationship. When I was living in Beaverton, my brother came to visit me one day, and we had a face-to-face conversation about what had been going on with him over the years we did not interact. He apologized to me for not being there for me and said that Jesus had spoken with him 10 years prior to this meeting, asking him to reconcile with me. He had chosen not to at the time, but it was uplifting for me to hear that Jesus cared about me so much as to intervene on my behalf. Remember, if you are at odds in a relationship with another person and you are tempted to think that God doesn't care about you, otherwise he would fix it, it might just be the other person's stubbornness standing in the way. Or maybe it's your own stubbornness. God may have made the invitation for reconciliation. He is just waiting for us or the other person to accept it. And sometimes we have to be okay with the fact that the invitation will never be accepted. But that doesn't mean that God hasn't extended it. I applied to nursing schools and was accepted to Walla Walla Community College. I moved back to Walla Walla for 2 years and finished nursing school in 2009. After that, I got a job in Goldendale, Washington, and worked there at a small hospital as a nurse. The next almost 10 years, I kind of would characterize as the lonely years of my life. Prior to this, I had always been pursuing some sort of goal and was plugged into some sort of community. Now I had arrived, right? I was finally on a career path I enjoyed. I made stable money. I enjoyed a decent house, but I basically had no community. My friends in the Yakima Valley lived a little over an hour away, and I took to spending most of my days off with them. They are hardworking people who have moved away from the apple orchards, but they still had acreage and horses in the Yakima Valley, and I found purpose in helping with various projects. The time in Goldendale was hard, though. I belonged to a church there, a small group of mostly older people, and did a little bit of community service, but I still didn't have a feeling of settledness. I bought a house in Goldendale and had a couple of issues with the bank based on the state the house was in. I was lamenting the issues during a visit to my mom's house one time, and my brother said, "Why don't you just build your own house?" Being a general contractor who had built many houses, I'm sure this seemed like no daunting task to him. To me, it seemed somewhat absurd, but not completely off the table. I returned to Goldendale, and right there across the street from my house was a dilapidated house for sale on a corner lot. I bet that's pretty cheap, I thought, back when real estate was affordable. And told my brother about it, and thus started the year that me and my brother built a house together. Mind you, he is not the most patient person on the face of the planet, and I have zero construction experience. So it made for an interesting time, but safe to say, I bought the lot, tore down the house, and my brother and I built a brand new house. Anytime we were out at a restaurant or at a hardware store and people heard about what we were doing, they would look at us with wide eyes and say, "I would never try to do anything like that with one of my siblings." We would just kind of look at each other and shrug and say, "It's going okay." Truthfully, the experience had its moments, like the night I was crying and telling him he should just hire someone with experience to help him finish the project, or the time he was screaming at me through an exhaust pipe on the one side of the wall while I stood on the other. Or when he stood at the top of a 20-foot ladder jammed into some skylights and told me he was just going to stand there and drink water while I, quotes, figured out how to make the complex cuts he was trying to get me to make with the sheetrock. We honestly, to this day, can both look back, however, and say that that year was one of the best experiences of our lives. Building that house gave me direction and purpose. Building our relationship was invaluable. Despite the past apologies and repair, we had never had an opportunity to spend any significant time together and actually work on relating to one another in a practical way. Working on that house together was quite possibly the best thing that could have ever happened to us, and we produced something beautiful as a result. You can go to Goldendale and see it to this day. Maybe a year prior to the house build, this is the part of the story where Ben likes to say, and then this man came into my life. Maybe a year prior to the house build, I was talking to my friends from the Yakima Valley, and they said they had had a visitor stay with them for the weekend. He was a man who was working for a friend of theirs as a truck driver. Having gotten snowed in at a truck stop in the valley, his boss told him to call some friends of his for a place to stay. When I first heard about this guy, I assumed it was some older trucker in his 60s or something. But eventually I learned this was a younger person, 6 years younger than me to be exact. He likes to remind me that when I graduated from high school, he was 12. But then, what's a few years between friends? As my parents let us know. Over the next few years, my friends would see this guy off and on when he would drive through the valley. I spent practically all of my days off with them, but Ben and I never crossed paths. However, as they described their interactions with him, I thought, this sounds like a person I would be interested in meeting. I was trying to just let things unfold as they may, but sometimes you just need to take matters into your own hands, you know? So finally, after months of no path crossing, I told my friends I would like them to just ask him if he would be willing to meet. He agreed, but followed it up with a compelling text about how he was really interested in this other girl, but yeah, he could spare me a minute of his time. After standing me up with another compelling text of something to the effect of, sorry, my schedule changed, I figured I didn't really need that in my life and moved on. Several months later, while in the midst of the house project, I received a text from Ben basically saying, hey, it didn't work out with the other girl, so how you doing? Inclined to blow him off, I messaged my friends and told them what he said. They encouraged me to give him a chance. Maybe he isn't the most eloquent of writers. I messaged him back and told him about the house project. We chatted back and forth for a couple months when it became apparent that the veil of social media was not helping us learn anything real about each other as people. I was kind of fed up and basically said, do you want to meet or what? He agreed, and our first meeting was at a Starbucks in Portland. He wore cologne and a sweater. I wore a Carhartt jacket and ordered hot chocolate. Afterwards, I told myself that if he messaged me and said he had a nice time, I would be out. He did message, but it was about the weather in Woodland, Washington, where he lived. It seemed like something a friend would say, so I answered him back. We dated for a total of a year prior to getting married. It was a very romantic and ethereal time. Picture literal blossoms wafting around as we would ride a forklift together, placing beehives in various orchards. We would write each other sappy stories and poetry, send each other sappy emojis via Messenger. It was gag-worthy but sweet. We got engaged at sunset on the prairie hills behind our friend's house in the Yakima Valley, and the rest, they say, is history. So here we are at this present day. Ben and I have been married for almost 10 years, and we have soon to be 5 kids. If any, 5, okay, it's a boy. I can definitely say that I no longer have the feeling of loneliness that walked with me through my Goldendale years. God has made me a part of a family. If I had to sum up my experience with God in one word, it would be reconciliation. I could have just as easily told you a story where my parents divorced bitterly and never spoken again. I could have told you I chose not to go on that trip to Hayden Lake and instead developed a deep resentment for my dad. My brother could have entrenched himself in pride and never asked my forgiveness. I could have done similarly and never spoken with him again. And this would have been the legacy passed on to our kids. Now I'm going to start crying. So make me laugh. My work today is to reflect God's character to my children, and those horrible stories are not what are going to be passed on to them. They know their grandpa from Texas and their Uncle Lee. They have the blessing of a bonus grandma in Terry. They know their Uncle Michael, my dad and Terry's son. They know that my mom, their Grandma Mary, and my dad used to be married, and they see them act with graciousness toward one another and even reminisce over old memories. There is the distinct possibility that the legacy I passed on to them could have been anger and division, but we all continually open our hearts to God's will, and He keeps bringing us back together. He is truly a God of reconciliation. I hope this story has provided encouragement to some of you today. From the year my dad was born until now is 81 years, so none of these things happen rapidly. Hebrews encourages us to run our races with endurance, and like Chris mentioned last week, if we don't stick with the climb, we might enjoy a nice rest on the first plateau, but we will never see the grandeur of the summit. God's work in my life has and continues to be both startling and humbling, and even when things are difficult, He is ever present and points the way forward. Thank you for your time today. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your work of reconciliation you have done on my behalf, on the behalf of my family, and on the behalf of everyone here. Please guide each of us in this continued path. Amen.